Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We've got a few people starting to come in, but we'll wait for a couple minutes. It's just 10 o'clock right now, so we'll give it a couple minutes for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. So thanks, everyone, for joining. We're going to put a poll out there as well for anybody who's already in the call and anyone who's joining right now, just to kind of see a little bit about where you're at right now with your with feeling, how your organization is feeling with using data. So Kate, why don't you set that poll up and have it so that people can start answering, and we'll see how people are feeling. It's looking like so far things are hovering right around the middle there, which is good.
It's positive. Our work here is done.
Absolutely. There's no ideas, please help yet, so that's positive as well. Although I think I should say, no matter what level of confidence you have, I think there'll be information out of this call that'll be useful for anybody, no matter what level you're at. So I'm excited to be able to share that. I think we can get started. I think there's still a couple people pouring in, but we've reached a good number right now. So let's kick things off. So with some brief introduction. So my name's Sebastian. I'm a partner manager at iATS Payments. I have the pleasure today of introducing a couple guests to this webinar from Sowen. So I really want to pass it to Sophie and Ori to give yourselves a bit of an introduction. Tell us who Sowen is, what kind of work it is that you're doing, and yeah, would love to hear a little bit from you to see how you can offer some good advice to the folks that are tuned in today.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's wonderful to be here. Um, we're really looking forward to this conversation. I'm Sophie Blondeau. I am a partner and the Chief Strategy Officer at Sowen. And we are a social impact consultancy, and our mission is to help organizations, nonprofits, social impact organizations harness the power of data and technology to really drive their mission and the positive social impact they're trying to make in the world. We were founded about 2018 as an offshoot of Bloomberg Philanthropies, and we work with a range of organizations, both small and medium size, and yeah, and that's what we do, and we're so happy to be here. And one of the things I want to say is I love the results of this poll, because what we love to do is really partner with these organizations to help them feel more confident, and to really collaborate with them to make them more efficient at what they do, and to start these cycles of impact, we call them, and how you can make those easier, faster, and achieve greater growth as you commit to this idea of using data in everything that you do. So we're happy to talk to people who feel confident and not so confident, because at the end of the day, I think everybody can come from a position of strength and just build up, and that's what we try and help people do. Ori?
Thank you, Sophie. My name is Ori Carmel. As Sophie mentioned, we started Sowen in 2018. We did so. I spent about 20 years in the private sector beforehand at multiple Fortune 500 companies and some startup companies. And we wanted to, for me, the start of Sowen was to bring the best practices, tools, rigor that I saw in the private sector to the purpose, mission, and ethos that exists in social impact organizations that live both in government, in nonprofits, and even in the private sector, and to test whether there is an opportunity to both, as we call it, do good and do well. So that's the ethos behind everything that we do. Super excited to be here. Looking forward to a conversation and the questions that come up.
Awesome, thank you so much. So today's webinar, so to speak, is going to be a little bit different than maybe some of the ones that you might be used to. We're not going to have a presentation. We're going to just mostly have a conversation here overall. So more kind of like a podcast style. And, in terms of that conversation and, given the title of this webinar, Data to Impact, I want to start broad and we'll narrow in a little bit. But the first question overall is, in the context of this conversation, what is your definition of the word impact? Because I think that's one of the things that a lot of organizations get told that they need to measure, that they need to manage, but a lot of times that actual concept isn't fully defined. And it means different things for different organizations. So in your words, I'd love to hear just kind of a first introduction and definition to what you think impact means from your experiences.
I think it's interesting. In this space, there are a lot of people who focus on a specific, channel or cause. And the benefit and the gift that we have as consultants is that our viewpoint is much broader. So when we talk about social impact, I think that there are two components that really matter to us. One, that it's measurable, and that is incredibly important to us. And I think for organizations that are dedicating their work to improving lives, that it has to be measurable. Obviously, that it has a positive perspective, right? It's a positive change. And I think that the other thing that is this positive change for a broad number of causes, whether it's societal, environmental, or an economic change. That's what we're looking to see. And lastly, I would say it's important to us that it impacts individuals, communities, and ultimately society, but not forgetting that at the end of the day, a lot of this social impact that we want to see is bit by bit. And I think that's going to be a theme, that we're going to repeat in this podcast. It's individual by individual, community by community, that you really get that measurable, sustainable change.
Awesome.
Yeah, I agree with everything said there. I think the one an additional emphasis point that I would place, especially nowadays, and we're seeing a ton of research come up on this, is understanding the well-being of individuals and communities, not just in physical well-being, but also in mental well-being and social well-being. Right, the fraying of connections between individuals, the polarization and bifurcation of conversation and discourse are all things that we're all experiencing all around us. And I see those as just as important, sometimes deeply, deeply linked to the physical well-being, to whether it's environmental causes or whether it's fighting poverty or homelessness or all of those causes. We try not to, we are not subject experts in a particular one of those fields. What we try and do is use data and technology to help the experts do what they do better. And to us, if we can measure that impact, that is meaningful. That is impact.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And I mean, talking about measurability and looking, we're already starting to get into some of these concepts of data. So in general, I mean, you've got plenty of experience working with organizations who have been working towards achieving what you just mentioned, measurable, repeatable impact overall. So, I mean, just to get started as well here, again, broad, what are some of the most common challenges that you see when folks are starting out on that journey, or, even if they're a bit along their way? Like, what are some of the things that you consistently see as either roadblocks or pitfalls that people typically either slow people down or make it really difficult to continue?
I can take a stab at that. I don't know what I don't always know what their real problem, like the deepest problems that they have, right? That changes from organization to organization. But I can tell you what are the things that we hear the most, especially early in conversations, right? And it's not 100% consistent, but there are certainly trends. One that definitely comes to mind is a real shortage of time to think. And I think time in general is something that we've been thinking about and doing a lot of research on. People don't have time to think. We hear this from executives. We hear this from, program people who run the programs on the ground. Everybody across the board, they don't have time to think. They're in this constant rat race. And 70 to 80% of their time, we have some research that's coming up in the next couple of months, 70 to 80% of their time, especially on the leadership side, is spent in reactive mode, you know, putting out fires, chasing their tail. They spend very little time, and they have very little time to think and to meaningfully solve problems. And that's a major challenge that everybody's experiencing. Um, Another one that comes to mind, about 10 years ago, I would say that we heard a lot more about we don't have the right data. I don't hear a whole lot of we don't have the right data. And when I do and we start poking away at it, it doesn't actually turn out to be we don't have the right data. I hear a lot more of we don't know how to use the data we have to the
Mhm.
best of our abilities. Oh, well, I got
Yeah,
some.
you're celebrating.
Yeah, I know, right? Like I got some hand recognition on mine. I need to see how it turned off. Um, so that's the second major one, right? Like we have the data, it's at our fingertips, or we can get to it pretty easily, but I'm not sure we're using it to the best of our ability or using it
Mhm.
correctly. And then a third one that comes to mind, I don't know about you, Sophie, but I know this is an area that you've spent more time on than I have, but the AI discussion is an obvious one, right? Major developments, especially over the last 12 to 18 months in that area, but there's still a lot of ambiguity. There's still a lot of uncertainty around how do we use this? Is this more than just like a tool that's going to help me, I don't know, rewrite my paragraphs or rewrite my emails? Areas of responsibility, right, around AI. Where's this data go and who owns it? Those types of questions. A lot of ambiguity around AI, a lot of opportunity around AI, but also a lot of organizations that are very aware of the risks
Mhm.
involved. So those are three things that come to mind for me. I don't know about you, Sophie.
I'd
I,
like,
Oh yeah, sorry.
sorry
Go ahead.
no, I
but
just wanted to add, sorry,
oh yeah, please.
sorry, I didn't hear you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say just quickly. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure tons of people are nodding on along when you're saying these issues of time and not having that time to think and working reactively. Because I mean, there are only so many hours in the day, and if folks are, especially if they're volunteers or if they're working in different contexts, it's really hard to find the time to do that. And overall, like, what's interesting as well is nowadays, the idea of like what is data and everything like that. That's sort of a moot point because everyone's collecting data in one form or another. And it really, I guess, goes back to that first point of like, how does it become meaningful? Like, what do you take from that, and how do you apply it in a context where you're achieving that definition of impact that you set right at the beginning? And Sophie, I did want to hear. Sorry to cut you off there. Didn't mean to jump in too much. I just got excited by what Ori said, but I was also just reminded that if anyone has any questions who's listening, there is a question box. Feel free to submit any questions that you want on anything that we're saying. And towards the end of the call, we'll make sure that we're leaving a space where we can answer any of those questions as well. So please feel free to do that. Forgot to mention that at the beginning, but yeah, Sophie, sorry.
No, I was just going to echo what Ori said and encourage people and remind people that sometimes it's very uncomfortable to take a beat and to step back to do some of that thinking and planning, because you're so pressed for time. But that time that you're taking actually is going to accelerate everything else that you do instead of feeling like I should be doing this, I should be doing this. And that's another thing that we hear from our partners all the time is I know I should be putting data at the center of everything I do. I know we should be collecting it. I know we should be thinking about this, but there's just not making the time. And I think that that's one of the harsh sort of recommendations that we have with our clients is you got to make the time. Like if it's important, you have to make the time and it will pay off, in the end and accelerate what you're trying to do, not hold you back.
That's a really interesting point. And I think overall, and I mean, from my own experience as well as from chatting with people, I think one of the things that people face a lot is that feeling of not being productive when they're sitting and thinking. Like you feel like you're not actually executing on anything or getting anything done, or whether or not there's going to be any results from sitting and thinking about it overall. So you mentioned, having hard conversations with folks. Like, what are some of the things that you focus in on? And I'm sort of asking this for people in the audience who either need to hear this themselves or they have somebody on their team that they're like, we need to sit down and think a bit more. Like, how do you normally convey that across and make sure that people realize the importance of taking that time of doing something that's quote unquote seen as unproductive?
Well, I think it goes back to what Ori was saying. We have a really good friend of ours, and we were just having this conversation at the beginning of the week, and he made this great point, and he said, data is kind of like broccoli. Like people like know they should be eating it, but they don't. Like you have to make it palatable, right? And I think this also connects to what Ori was saying about AI. The reality is data, technology, all things that are going to accelerate what you're trying to do, but it is pretty much useless if you don't have a good strategy. So that's the first conversation. Like we're not here to just tell you data is good for you, broccoli is good for you. It's like we're here to truly understand what you are trying to do and accomplish. And that really, really, really starts with, your key stakeholders. Who are your key stakeholders, both internal and external, and what is your mission and vision and purpose, right? So just like you wouldn't start an organization without those core principles in place, right? You have to take the time to establish that foundation, right, before you take the activity. So you might feel really good that you've created the website, but if you haven't done the strategic work for what that mission, vision, purpose is for your organization, that's not going to be very helpful. So to your point, you've done an activity, you've created the website, you've joined, a group, a working group, but if you don't have that clearly defined, you really don't have the foundation that you need to succeed. So those sometimes people don't want to hear because they don't, they don't want to start. They feel like they've made progress and they feel like they've got momentum, and it does take a moment to sit in being uncomfortable in the, not knowing.
I would also connect, so I think that's really important, the strategy, getting that right, getting clarification, making sure that the entire organization or the important people are behind that, are aligned on that. It's shocking to me how rarely that actually happens. When we go into a new engagement or a new partnership, how big of gaps there sometimes exist within the organization of different understandings or different interpretations of the strategy. I would tie it back to your first question, Sebastian, as well, in that it also is important to tie it to tangible results and measurable impact, right? So the strategy is great, but unless it translates to real results, then it's just strategy. I always, when I was on the private sector side and on the public sector, I've always hated working with consultants who, what's the expression? Like they take their watch and then they tell you what time it is. Like I hated that. I really hated that. I hated the approach of like 500-page decks that don't really mean anything and it's all fluffy language and there's no actual tangible implementation. So I think, making sure that you then work with them side by side, shoulder to shoulder, get dirt under your fingernails and see implementation and then be able to measure the results is super, super important, because that's where the proof is, right? So we try in all of our projects, and I think it's really important in all projects to get really, really specific about what it is that you're going to measure, and then have you accomplish those things? If so, great. How can you amplify them? If not, why not? So you can optimize.
One thing I would add, Sebastian, too, that when we talk about the tough conversations, and I don't want to be the person who's doing all the mean talking, but it's also acknowledging that it's a lot of the work that we do is not going to be linear, and not going to be instantaneous, and there's going to be some bumps in the road, and it's okay. Like, reinforcing that to our partners is actually a really key part of our job, because that's the reality.
I'm curious, and I want to get into some of the other stuff that we have here as well. But that, I think, is one of the challenges I think that nonprofits face in that sphere as well, is when you've got constrained budgets and you've got sort of a short runway ahead of you of what you can sort of see happening. Having these sort of really long-term, vision-oriented conversations can sometimes be a little bit tough to stomach, because it's like, oh, that would be great if I only had the time to do it. And I do understand the point of, it will pay off and it does have its value and it's worth doing. And I guess the question is kind of leaning into, where does that cultural shift come from? Where do you bring that in? Why is it so hard for people to eat their broccoli for the most part? I mean, to get to that place, as you mentioned, like what are some of the things that you found frustrating in that are, of course, they're not going to be linear. It's not going to be perfect all the time, but just to kind of really understand, help people get on the same page of this challenge that we're talking about? Like, what is that sort of cultural piece, specifically in the nonprofit space, that people are struggling with and need to sort of learn to take those steps and learn to understand the value of that?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the most challenging things that the nonprofit space has adopted from the private sector that has had more of an adverse effect than a positive one has been the approach to time,
Mm,
right? Um, in the private sector, for the most part, certainly for publicly traded companies, but also for non-publicly traded companies, things are measured in quarterly results, right? Like that is the cycle of activity. Um, and everybody's a quarterly employee, right? For the most part, with a few exceptions, but generally speaking, everything is measured in quarterly results. And in our efforts to adopt better work practices, better methodologies, better efficiencies from the private sector, which we should do, one of the things that we adopted was a quarterly approach to social impact. Here's the challenge, right? If you're talking about economics, quarterly works or can work great, right? Because you can see your EBITDA change by a quarter, you can see your sales, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, social change rarely happens within a quarter, right? These things take time to happen. So there's an inherent dissonance between the time horizons that we should be approaching things from a private sector perspective versus a public sector perspective. And that creates a challenge. That creates a challenge. There is no perfect solution to it. I think it takes a lot of explaining and understanding to the organization, to more importantly to the organization's stakeholders, that some of these things take time. It also requires some adjustment on part of the organizations that are doing the social impact work to identify what are the things that they can demonstrate impact or progress on in short to medium term timeframes. So it doesn't have to be, hey, the city of San Francisco has solved the homelessness problem or the unhoused issue in the city of San Francisco. It can be, hey, in these past 2 quarters, we have seen a decrease of X percentage in some impact measurement. Why that matters to them. So to integrate those into your plans, into your working plans and your roadmaps is super important. Inherently, there's always going to be that dichotomy, that conflict between time horizons. And that's something that I think as an industry, as a social impact industry, which I include private sector, public sector, philanthropic, academic, and government entities in, it's something that we need to deal with, something that we need to reckon and think about.
Really
So
interesting.
no perfect answer, but
Yeah.
nuggets of, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, this is one of those things where there's not one cookie cutter solution that's going to work for everybody. But in terms of defining a solution and helping give people tools, I do want to shift focus a little bit onto infographic that Sowen recently put out. So I'm going to share my screen, and to anybody who's listening or watching, we'll absolutely share this to everybody and everybody who's participating. But basically what we have here, and I'll just kind of zoom out to show it in large. I won't go into every single little detail here because there's quite a lot of really useful information in here. But I want to hear a little bit about, start thinking about solutions, or how can people take approaches to these challenges. Because I think at this point we've laid out all these things that are making people like anxious. They're like, yes, I know, yeah, I'm in that situation. So what's sort of the next step? And I mean, just to kind of kick it off, I really like just this first paragraph here about like the framework to follow, because especially this last little bit that's saying that this framework is for the developing the capabilities that trigger and perpetuate a true and sustainable cultural change. And I think the term sustainable cultural change is really interesting in here because we're talking about data and something that's like seems like a hard science, but with something that's about data. So can you explain that a little bit about what that sort of means? And if you want, of course, we can also go through the infographic here as well. But I'd love to hear a bit of your thoughts about what went into designing this and about the experience that created this information.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. One of the things that we heard from our partners, right, is like you said, everybody knows that you should put data at the center of your activities. Everybody buys into the benefits of starting that cycle by placing data at the center. The reality is they're lacking the time and they didn't really have a really good way of having a starting point. So it's very difficult, right, to give people advice to say you should do this and then you kind of walk away and they're like, well, where do I start with the limited time resources that I have? So that was really the impetus behind this framework, was to give like a holistic picture of, if you place data at the center of your organizational activities, this is what it could look like, and this is the impact it can have on your entire organization, so that by little you create a culture that is data driven, which will lead you to have more impact, measurable impact, and by the way, increase your level of innovation, because insights might come out because you're actually tracking this throughout the organization. Ori, do you want to add anything? I mean, that's really where we started. And we found that, our partners really appreciate having this overview roadmap of what it could look like, but also having different points where you can come in, which you can come in at any point in this framework. That's the other thing. And you don't have to do all the steps, and you don't have to do them in this order, right? This is sort of the elements that we've seen are at the center of success for organizations who are trying to achieve this goal of being a data-driven organization.
Yeah, I think the last point is really, really important. This is presented visually for the sake of simplicity in a linear way, but um, these things are rarely linear, as Sophie mentioned earlier. We have partners who come in and they're like, "Hey, can you help me create a better data-driven culture?" And we work on some of that stuff, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, wait, we really need to revisit our strategy, right? Because our culture is not aligned, and that is a derivative oftentimes of a misalignment on the strategy, right? Or we don't have a full understanding of our stakeholders, or maybe our audiences have changed, right? We started 10 years ago and that was what we were doing there, and things have evolved since. And we really need to re-examine our stakeholders. So that happens all the time, all the time. That is great. Like, that's great. That's great because we get to solve tough problems, and that's great because we get to help them think strategically and holistically, um, while combining the actual activities that will drive impact. I do want to point out that one of the other areas, and you asked in an earlier question where we get a lot of pressure points and pain points, the bottom is really one that a lot of organizations that we've been speaking to, especially over the past 2-3 years, have struggled with. So it seems like there's more competition for budgets, for either budgets or gifting, or any kind of resource allocation, and organizations are really struggling at the refining their stories, you know because we don't make decisions based on data, right? We make decisions based on stories. We are emotional creatures, right? And we always overestimate the role of data in our decision making. So the data is great as a starting point to tell stories, but you need to wrap it in the ethos and the story and the conflict and those types of things. And then you need to understand how to share it with your most critical stakeholders, whether you're looking for more funding, whether you want to reach out to more people, et cetera, et cetera. So that storytelling component is really become another point where we spend a lot of our time on.
Yeah, this is a fantastic resource. I mean, it really is kind of a cheat sheet for anybody to be able to go in and I mean, it's such a good point. Organizations do change all the time, and it's an obvious thing to say, but at the end of the day, it's so easy to have yesterday's processes and technology and strategy when today's reality is quite different. So I mean, keeping that in mind and making sure that these are all things that I mean for any organization make a lot of sense. And there's quite a bit of content in here that I think people can get a lot of value. So I'm excited to share this with the audience as well. You have that assessment as well that we've shared in the past to our audience, but we'll share it as well out of this one, where anybody, no matter what stage they are in their data maturity journey, can go through a quiz overall to see what some of the next steps are that they can take. What I kind of want to understand a little bit is a bit about your process as an organization. So when you approach or when you begin working with a partner, how does this framework and this methodology get put into action?
So the very first thing, and I think that this is, uh, key to what we do is we don't assume anything. So the first step in any project that we do is a very long discovery process. Because at the end of the day, the organizations that we work with know their work the best, know their organization the best, know their stakeholders the best. So we are very much that's where we start every project, is very much in the active listening mode, gathering all that information and reflecting back to that organization. This is what we heard. Did we hear that correctly? Because as Ori said, for example, we just worked with an organization in the UK that came to us to measure their impact so that they could basically go back to their original funder and prove that they were making progress and find ways of getting more funding, right? So they came to us with, how can we measure the impact? And then how can we tell that story? So that was our project. But the very first thing we did was do a huge workshop on stakeholders. Who are your stakeholders? Like, what do they want? What does success look like for them? What do they need to hear? Right? Because if we just say, oh, this is how you should be measuring impact, that's really not helpful. It's like, how are these stakeholders measuring impact? And then we can talk about the best way to measure that impact and tell that story back to them. So the very first thing we do is discovery. I will say that it's a step-by-step process in every case that usually leads to a new recommendation. So if you're measuring impact, right, that's your goal, but you do not know what your capabilities are, or if you don't have a good snapshot of that, or you overestimate where your capabilities are, that's going to show up in the process. And, we're always very honest and forthright. And we're going to say, well, you want to measure the impact, but you don't have the infrastructure in place to measure that. So the very first step is, make sure that infrastructure is in place. So that is, super important to know that these things are interrelated. And one project can lead to another recommendation, but at the end of the day, it's always a very actionable one and related to their reality. Ori?
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. I don't have too much to add there. I did want to point to some thoughts that I had around culture. Culture is really hard to
Please.
measure. Culture is really hard to measure, and there's a lot of biases because when you're thinking about culture and talking about culture and asking people in an organization about culture, you're going to get a lot of opinions. And opinions are great, but they're extremely biased, right? So we can issue all the surveys that we want about employee engagement and whether people are happy with the culture and things like that. So when we deal specifically with culture, I'm always interested in finding a way to complement or triangulate between qualitative and quantitative, between different types of information, between different sources of information to get a well-rounded view. That's the one where the conversation always has more gray areas. And it's such an interesting topic to me, right? The modern workplace in general. We're walking into a workplace where for the first time ever, we're going to have 5 generations working in the same office, virtually or physically.
I was going to say.
So that area is particularly interesting to me, and there's a lot to explore there.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, there are so many aspects of culture that are measurable, but seeing that holistically and what it looks like is also something it's one of those things that almost you feel it when you're in a situation, but it's hard to describe overall. And no, super interesting. And I think I want to kind of go back to what Sophie was saying a little bit as well, in terms of that example that you had where you kind of got all those stakeholders aligned and you got people kind of on the same page. I'm curious as well. So, if you have a couple other examples of when things went well, or when things were frustrating and maybe didn't go the way that you wanted them to, like you followed every single step, you did everything the way that it was supposed to go, but you just didn't see the impact or the change that you were expecting. And maybe if you could, walk us through a bit of a story there. Speaking of storytelling.
I think that I'll just go back one step, right? When you said, what's our process? So lesson learned, when you have a champion within the organization, it's a much easier process, right? So we've seen things be a little bit more challenging while we don't have somebody within the organization who's championing the effort, right? And it becomes like you're trying to convince 3 or 4 stakeholders, and everybody gets a little territorial, and the vision for where we're all going gets a little bit fuzzy. So that's definitely one step that's super important. The other thing too is that different portions of the organizations have different processes. So that's also really challenging, right? So even if we all agree that the impact that we're measuring is X, and the KPIs are Y, some people are going to achieve that goal earlier or are going to be able to implement it earlier than others, right? So for example, if you're the manager of the community platform, right, and it's something that is very agile and easy to change, you can start implementing those recommendations like that. If you're the director of programming, right, and it means creating a whole new course, advertising that course, finding the teacher for that course, it's much more difficult to implement the recommendation and therefore see the impact, even though the impact might be proven out to be 6 months down the road. But you still have to keep people believing that it's worth the effort to implement those recommendations. So that's where we know that, and that's particularly true with larger organizations that have multiple divisions. Much more difficult than the one project we just did in the UK with prostate cancer research. We had one champion. The whole team looked to him, and he was able to be, an ambassador both ways, right? This is what my team is feeling, and then going back and saying, this is what they can accept and what they can't. So those are two things that we found to be true in a lot of cases.
Really
Yeah,
interesting.
I have another
Please, yeah.
lesson learned story. If we're sharing things that I would have done differently. We worked, so a lot of times, we always say, executive support or executive buy-in is super important. And it's true. Executive buy-in is super important. But one lesson that I have had to kind of adjust to and learn the hard way is to identify when leadership is just checking the box because they have to, versus when leadership is truly invested in creating change, whether it's technical change, whether it's measurement, or whether it's cultural change, especially when it's cultural change. So we were working with this partner that shall remain nameless, and great organization, incredible cause. They were creating all these programs, and their goal was to make sure that these programs translated to improved happiness, well-being, physical and mental well-being for their audience. I'm intentionally being vague here. They were a part of a larger organization, and the leadership in that organization, what they wanted to see were fairly basic, like 1997 type of metrics. They wanted to see people on the website. you know and the conversation was like, well, we can get you all the people on the website that you want. We can take $1 million and farm it out to bots and from all kinds of dark corners of the web, and you'll quadruple your website traffic tomorrow. But does that equate to meaningful impact on people's health and well-being? And we couldn't get them to take that next step, right? We couldn't get the leaders of the organization that we were working with directly to stand up for the right thing and say, hey, the traffic numbers to our website don't actually matter. Here's the true measure of impact that we are making, and we're going to stand behind that. And that's a place where if we had to do things over, I would have tried to stand our ground a little bit more firmly and say, hey, this is really not the right measure. And we didn't, and we kind of spent a lot of time in things that I don't think we that truly generated real impact. And those other types of lessons that I take with me to call BS when BS needs to be called.
Yeah. No, great suggestion. Oh, sorry, Sophie, I don't know if you wanted to.
I was going to just share a happy story.
Please. Yeah.
And our happy stories are when we get to work with an organization and their leadership team and we get invited to the higher level conversations when the strategy is being set for the year, and we are trusted enough to be part of those conversations, because that makes it so much easier to help them help themselves, and tailor solutions that are, accepted by the Thai organization. You become part of their culture, and that is like the best possible scenario as far as I'm concerned, when you get that level of trust.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I have so many questions I'd like to ask and follow up about that. But unfortunately, we are starting to come up on our time limit, and we've got a couple questions here from the listeners that I want to make sure we leave enough time to answer. But I guess just to wrap things up and to close off, I imagine a decent percentage of the people who signed up for this webinar are those champions within their organizations who are telling people on their teams, hey, we need to have a more data-driven culture. We need to do these things in XYZ, who are fully subscribed to this methodology. So what's a first actionable step that anybody listening at organizations large and small, like from the most resource strapped to a one where they've got a little bit more freedom to move, what are some practical actionable next steps that you'd say they can start taking right away to start seeing an effect on their organization?
Have a really easy first step.
Mm.
And it's like it's really starting your own discovery process. I said like the first, it's sort of a design axiom, right? Know what you're designing for. Like, you don't want to just create a solution just to create a solution. So you need to know where you're starting, and you need to have an honest snapshot of where you're starting if you want to really commit to being a data-driven organization. So there are many, many models out there, many, different tools you can use, but we have one at Sowen that we're more than happy to share with everybody after this call, which basically just gives you a very quick 5-minute survey that you can take to really see from a knowledge perspective, from a tools perspective, from a people perspective, where are we starting from? Do we have the data? Do we have the tools? Do people know where that data sits? Do we have people have the right skills to interpret the data that we have? So that would be my recommendation, is start at the beginning. And that's the easiest first step, to have that snapshot, because then you can have my second recommendation, and that's a coaching recommendation, is always take the step that's closest to you, that's going to give you the maximum benefit. So don't get overwhelmed like we could do all these things. Just have a clear snapshot and take that first, most productive first step for your organization.
I think I mean, I really like that survey that you've put together too, because it really organizes like what are the buckets of information that we need to capture. So, a lot of people might try to capture that information but forget about capturing where does the knowledge sit, like who owns this information, and that's such an important piece to what you're doing as well. And I think to that taking that first step, I think for anybody who's thinking that it's overwhelming, start small. Starting small is super important as well, with something that you can prove to be successful, and then grow from there. But Ori, I want to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think that the tool that we have, and there's lots of diagnostics tools out there. There's lots of these types of tools out there. We tried to create one that aligned to our experience with our partners. It's not a diagnostic tool, right? It's a starting point to create a deeper diagnosis. That should happen through a really good discovery phase, as Sophie mentioned earlier. So it's important but I think it's a great starting point, right? I really like your point about starting small. Sophie touched on it as well. I wrote down, find the easy win, right? Like I said, we dramatically overestimate the role of logic and rationale in our decision making, and dramatically underestimate the role of emotion. If you can show somebody that you have generated an easy win for them, solved something for them, whether they knew that it was a problem or whether they knew that you were working on it, come to them with a solution, come to them with something that helps them tangibly and meaningfully to even the smallest thing. And that's going to go a lot further than giving them the theory about why they should do something, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that your question made me think about is a bit of a flip side. When these things don't happen, when you're not seeing progress, don't take it personally. That's my other advice to people. Change is really, really hard for people. Change in organizations is even harder because there's more people, right? And there's more politics and things like that. So I've been in that position where I've taken it, and I think you can tell. You know me by now, Sebastian. I'm a relatively emotional creature, and I've taken it so personally, and oftentimes that has led me to make mistakes, even mistakes that have got me fired. So don't take it personally. It just means that the organization or the person that's making the decision is not ready to make the change. Now, that doesn't mean you have to stay there. That doesn't mean that there aren't things for you to do, but it's not necessarily, it's almost never about you and the change that you are proposing. It's more about them or their perspective on where the organization is. So creating some level of emotional disconnect, I can't believe I'm saying this, that these words are coming out of my mouth, but creating some level of emotional disconnect is probably a good idea.
And Sophie said it a couple times, but I think what really reinforces what you're saying is that progress or change in any of these senses is not linear. Like at the end of the day,
Yeah.
like I've had to lead a few transformation projects internally in organizations, and you end up creating a whole bunch of resources, and only a small percentage of them actually get used and adopted. But the thing is, just because you're creating them doesn't mean it's useless work. Like at the end of the day, it might not be useful, you might not see that impact now, but in 6 months when somebody asks a question, you're like, oh, actually, I have something for that, and it's there. Because as long as you know, again, going to Sophie's point, understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve and having that discovery well done, and lining that up with your culture, your vision, your strategy, and understanding where you need to go, then the resources will exist and they'll be useful. Maybe not now, but they will be as you go forward, and they're going to make more of an impact than you can imagine. And it's, another thing too, speaking about culture, it's inspiring other people that they have the agency to do these things as well. And, it's a snowball that grows there overall. And hopefully that ties in a lot of these themes in that we've been talking about, but we're in the last 5 minutes. So I do want to ask a question that we got from the audience, which is, if you suggest having a champion, how does that person maintain a team concept and avoid dictatorial tendencies, which I can imagine, I guess, when you're dependent on that one person. So I'm curious. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that everybody's different, right? But I would say that co-creating all of these efforts is super important, right? So I think that if you are the person leading or championing this effort, you have to be very, very prepared to do a lot of active listening and a lot of mirroring. And by that, I mean really listening to what the person's saying to you and making sure that you say back to them in some way, shape, or form to make sure that you are completely aligned. Because again, I'm a huge believer in strong foundations, right? So that would be one. And again, having measurable goals, like what are you going to champion? Like what does success look like? And it's not just the champion's version of success, but again, the stakeholders, in this case, the internal stakeholders, would they define success? Is it be able to find that report in less than 2 minutes? Is it be able to have the statistics on a monthly basis to create the stories and the marketing materials? Like it has to be very specific. So co-creating and active listening and smart goals from your key stakeholders so that you're all rowing in the same direction, super important.
Yeah.
That's great. And what I like about that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, what I really like about what Sophie was saying about all those things, that it creates accountability overall as well for people on the team. And when you've got that shared accountability, it's easier to keep everyone in check. Sounds a little bit like, I don't know, but you know what I mean? It's, more making sure everyone's aligned, I guess, so to speak, and putting it into business words.
Yeah, I think Sophie is better at that stuff than I am, right? So in the part where we need to help a champion not be a dictator,
Yeah.
and make sure that that champion is open to internal perspectives and gets the team around. Because having a champion doesn't mean that you're creating a dictator. It just means that you're creating a focal point for other people, all the other people in the organization who also need to contribute to this, to galvanize around. So when those types of things happen, there is a certain level of work that we need to do, and sometimes it's talking about what is leadership and what type of
Mm,
leadership best fits the situation in the organization or the person, and how to get people to buy in and all those things. So there's a lot of work that oftentimes gets done there in that effort to get internal alignment and co-creation
yeah.
of the strategies. That's really, really important.
I
And the
think
other
there
thing I would
too.
And
Oh,
Sophie does
sorry.
that. Like I'm
Just,
terrible at that kind of stuff. So
yeah, no problem. No
The one
problem.
thing I would add, Sebastian, that is, to like round up this conversation and the points that we just made, I often say to Ori and I often say to our partners, we are all a work in progress, and that's
Mm,
okay.
yeah.
I
I think
mean,
asking why is
we're
helpful
all,
too. Like
yeah,
yeah.
making
nobody's
sure if,
perfect.
yeah, and if somebody is acting that way, is asking why, like asking yourself, why is that? And making sure that you can approach that conversation in understanding the person's motivations. So I don't know if the webinar is gonna get cut off in a second because the time's running out. Okay, no, good. I was worried about that for a second. I was worried we were gonna get cut off mid-sentence. So that's why I interjected there, Sophie. Sorry about that. But what I wanted to do, just kind of to wrap things up, or if you wanted to elaborate on that, honestly, I think that's a really good point to continue
Oh,
just
all
diving
good.
in for 5 more minutes, maybe.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I think we've said enough on that topic. I think the point that Sophie's made is change is really hard.
yeah,
It's hard for people and harder for organizations. I would strongly recommend, if anybody gets a chance to read a really interesting book that was written a while back. It's a bit Kool-Aidy. It's called Work Rules. It was written
mm,
by Laszlo Bock. He was the chief people officer at Google a while back when Google was a much smaller company. And it talks about how they created the Google culture at that time. The Google culture has changed multiple times since. But just a really interesting take on how to create culture. So if that is an area of interest for people, a good
thanks for
read.
sharing. Yeah, we can link to it as well in the
Sure.
follow up and in when we've got the recording as well, just so if people are interested, they can find that there. Any additional information? Where can people find more about Sowen, learn more from your wisdom that you've shared today? Where could you direct people that you think is a useful place for them to get any more information if this conversation sort of inspired them to look a bit more deep into this?
Go to
Well,
our
you can
website. Yeah,
go to our website.
go
And
to our
also,
website.
as
Look
you
us up
can
on
tell, we're
LinkedIn.
very shy. We're very shy. We don't like to talk, I'm joking. So, I mean, we're always happy to have conversations and, like bounce ideas around with new people. We always say that social impact is a team sport and we love to be part of the team. So, reach out to us through LinkedIn or through we'll share our emails with you and we would be more than happy to have casual conversations to follow up on any topics that we covered today.
Yeah, it's really important for me. Like, we're not the hero of the story. Like, we'd love to talk and we'd love to help, as Sophie mentioned, but just getting these types of conversations, getting these types of questions that don't always have like a direct answer, but getting people to think about these tough questions and integrate these components of change into their organization. Like, that's what actually matters. That's why, we left the private sector to do social impact work. Um, so yeah, I'm more interested in that than you know anything else. I think that's more important in the big picture than anything else.
Well said. Ori, Sophie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your generosity with your knowledge and with everything that you've shared today. And I hope everyone got a lot out of it. We'll send the recording. We'll send all this information to everybody who registered to the webinar. And I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sebastian. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.